Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to, if you can believe it, the 9th episode of Bios and Bookmarks. It feels like just the other day we were getting started. This is an online reading series featuring Caribbean authors, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I am beyond excited to be talking today with Tessa McWatt. Tessa, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
It's my honor. I'm so pleased to be here, Shivani, and to be talking to you.
Thank you, Tessa. So for those of you who don't know, and I don't think you would, Tessa's extraordinary newest book, Shame on Me, is this year's winner of the non-fiction category of the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature. It is an extraordinary book on many fronts, not the least of which, because it feels to me, more so now than ever, that it is absolutely a necessary book for our times, for all times, and for markedly the space in which we are living in the US, in the UK, and in Caribbean space, and a combination of all those three. So without further ado, I'd love us to get things started by inviting Tessa to read from Shame on Me. Tessa?
Thanks, Shivani. Yeah, the book is divided in, it's set up as an experiment, a kind of science experiment. So it's divided into 4 sections: hypothesis, experiment, analysis, and findings. And I'm going to read from the experiment section of the book. 8 years old, I am sitting near the back of the room in the grade 3 classroom of my suburban Toronto elementary school. My desk is close to the window and I'm easily distracted by the birds, one particular bird that preens itself on a branch, its feathers shuddering up and down. I'm not paying much attention to what the teacher is saying. We've been reading a book out loud together and I haven't been asked to read. I feel off the hook, set free to dream. A few minutes into daydreaming, I feel a change of tone in the teacher's voice and the class goes quiet. I snap out of my reverie. There's a question in the air. I look around at my classmates who are looking at each other in search of an answer. Anyone know what that word means? The teacher says. Oh, I think I'd better pay attention because there's a new word and I will need to know it. Does anyone know what Negro means? Good question, I think. What does that mean? I continue to look around at my classmates to see if anyone is going to come up with the answer or even a guess. The teacher seems anxious. This word has weight. Kenneth Percy puts up his hand. The teacher invites him to speak. Yeah, Tessa, he says, as he points towards me at the back of the room. Everyone in the class turns to face me. I freeze, my mind goes blank, and all that is going on in my body is a low fizz like a misfiring electric circuit. As I now realize, my teacher tries to rescue me from something she herself sees as a slur, a word that is fine in a book, but not in person. Oh no, not Tessa, she says, to comfort me and all those who might worry about what is in their midst. The other kids continue to stare at me. Doing her job as the class's moral compass, she thinks fast. No, Tessa's something else. The misfiring electric circuit spews shocks through my cheeks, my arms, and my legs, which begin to shake. What are you, Tessa? What am I? I have no idea what she's asking. I feel as if I failed a major test. I should have been paying attention. I should know how to answer this. You know, people are certain things, she says, still trying to help, but wounding me deeper and deeper with every second she allows the class's eyes to remain on me. Things like, say, Mexican. She waits, but I have nothing. Brazilian, Filipino. She carries on, offering possibilities she sees in my face. But in that moment, I hear only words that describe all the things that everyone else in the room isn't. She waits, the circuit hums, and it becomes so unbearable that I fold my arms on the desk and put my head onto them. I go away deep inside myself. I don't remember where I go or for how long, but when I look up again, everyone in the class has gone to recess and the teacher is wiping the board. She doesn't try to speak to me as I get up from my desk and leave the room. heavier now, saddled with something corrosive. There, with my head in my arms, I learned that I could disappear. I could become invisible. I wondered why the teacher had not asked anyone else in the class the question, why my best friend didn't have to answer it. I kept these questions and my invisibility to myself. I understood, without being able to articulate it, that language had the power to change me completely with the utterance of one word. I had known what Black was. Our extended family and friends were an array of shades, and I had known where I was from, but that wasn't what I had been asked. Negro was a word like species, a scientific word that clever people knew, but I didn't. I began to pay attention to the power of words. In being asked what I was and realizing I didn't know, I set off to find out. I believe it was the moment I became a writer. Images visit me now as the sun sinks below the North London rooftops in Kilburn, where I sit at my desk thinking about shame. They come in flashes like newsreels from the past. There is my Chinese grandmother running from rape. She is running also because she comes from a family of people who are running away in their DNA. Born to Chinese parents who had arrived in British Guyana from Hong Kong towards the end of the 19th century, my grandmother's family had escaped the Sino-Japanese War after a different uncle, a dentist, had been strapped to his own dentist chair and shot in the head by a Japanese soldier. When I imagine my grandmother as a young woman, she is running. My mother gave me the story of her mother's rape when I was a teenager. Granny ran away from the countryside, she said, and nearly whispered the rest. I assumed it was her way of warning me about the perils of being a woman, as she had warned me about so many perils as a child. But it was the running and not the rape that stayed with me. I wanted to run towards something that was mine, like most teenagers do, and I wanted to understand what to do with all the words in constant motion in my mind. My mother often let slip nuggets of family history that were at times uncomfortable, at other times mysterious and poetic, and at still other times so distant and unreachable that they could only become myth. She had no way of knowing that she was feeding a writer, and I had no way of knowing what truths she was avoiding or concocting. Like most families, mine is steeped in the anecdotes of grandparents and parents who recount their histories through the lens of desire, aspiration, loss, and shame. We Caribbean families rely heavily on oral histories because we come from ruptured roots, transplantation, and whispered heritages related to slavery and colonialism. There are no solid family trees or untraceable lineages for substantial strands of my ancestry. So there's no knowing for sure where, when, or why my ancestors fled or were forcibly taken, or how they arrived in what officially became British Guyana in 1831. Of course, there are the grandparents I knew and many uncles and aunts, both blood related and not, but I can only imagine those who went before them. I know from stories that my ancestry includes Scottish, English, French, Portuguese, Indian, Amerindian, African, and Chinese forebears. And there are rumors of hidden bloodlines, that possible French Jew. My Indian ancestors' journey from the subcontinent might be one of those documented in the logbooks of governors and plantation overseers as they procured indentured labor for the colony. There was a scarcity of women. Slavery had been abolished. She was precious goods arriving on a boat that carried 244 Indians, 233 of whom were men, 6 of them children, and only 4 other women. I imagine she resisted it, but necessity won out and she was forced to bed the overseer to secure the chance of early freedom from her indenture contract. Others' stories bear the weight of secrets, like smuggled Portuguese lace, and they must never be openly mentioned. But some are playful and dance with the tropical light. My indigenous great-great-grandmother was described to me by my mother as a buck. My daddy's family had buck in them, she would say, a word that obscures the proper names of peoples, Arawak, Waro, Arakuna, Akawayo, Patamuma, Wapishana. Buck, in the way my mother said it, meant a wild thing, a man with a spear, a woman free to roam the jungle. I imagine this woman content, alone in her corriel. When I paddle a canoe on a lake in Ontario, bounded only by the earth, sky, and water, while wildlife plays and hunts in the shadows along the shore, I'm like her. The Scottish McWatt of my surname and the English heir of my mother's side are my links to Europe. I had once imagined that I was secretly related to the Jane of my favorite book. But names themselves are unreliable. McWatt or heir might have been names my ancestors took to anglicize or legitimize themselves in a former slave colony. Whispers and shadows, a longing to belong to the mainstream of a new place after the rupture from their places of origin. It's my African ancestor, my great-great-grandmother, on whom I focus my imagination. She is the gap in my family's storytelling that I need to fill, though I can't trace her precise roots in Africa. Hers is the story that has been buried deepest, most painfully ignored. Hers is a story that bears such deep shame that it has been erased. But the body is a site of memory. If race is made by erecting borders, my body is a crossing, a hybrid many times over. My black and white and brown and yellow and red body is stateless, is chaos. Her body is stolen territory. I am the result of the movement of bodies on ships, as captains, as cargo, as indentured servants, as people full of hope for a chance of survival. I also come from people nearly annihilated by those who arrived. Guyana, formerly British Guyana, a territory won by the British from Dutch and French treaties of war in the early 1800s, is the only English-speaking country in mainland South America. It is culturally Caribbean, but geographically continental. Its pulsing river arteries connect mountains, savanna, rainforests, and coastal plains. It is a land of jaguars, tapirs, giant anteaters, otters, monkeys, and capybara, and it has one of the highest levels of biodiversity in the world. It is a land fought over for its natural resources, and its colonial history is a story that relies on ships from Europe, Africa, India, and China, along with the dugout coils of the indigenous people. The paddles, the sails, the winches, the shackles. My ancestry centers on one crop, sugar. My history pulses with moments of miscegenation, a hybridity that eludes any box I am asked to tick on census papers or job applications. I am a song of sugar. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that powerful and moving reading, Tessa. I'd like to begin our discussion by, first of all, welcoming those of you who've just joined us from all over the world. We're really glad that you're here for Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. Thank you for your presence and for your attention. So as Tessa and I get into conversation, please feel free to leave your questions and comments for her in the comment box at the side or beneath your screen, and we will definitely engage with them. So Tessa, thank you again for that very moving reading. As I was telling you just before we started, Shame on Me was a book that I found unputdownable in the most necessary ways. It was speaking, and I find this astonishing and a real feat of accomplishment. So personally, about your own family history and yourself, and centering your uncomfortable growth and confrontation, while also drawing so widely on a cross-section of regional Caribbean experiences, of history, of the experiences of other writers. So I'd like us to begin talking today about what the real genesis of Shame on Me was for you. Was there a moment in time when the need to tell this story became overwhelming? And if so, when was that?
Yeah, I think it's a book that I've been writing my whole life. I think it's something that, since that moment in the classroom, that I've been on a quest to understand, and I've been, really trying to unpack what race is and how I fit into the equation, being so multiracial. Where do I sit? How do I sit comfortably? I grew up in white suburban neighborhood in Toronto, and I learned a whiteness that was deeply ingrained, which is part of the shame of the book, the part of the title shame. But and as a result of growing up in a liberal country where accomplishments are acknowledged, and there is some kind of moving through a structure, I felt that I was able to fight to move through, to get my voice heard, to write about race without writing directly about race. So I've been writing about race my whole life, but very indirectly through characters. And then as we all know, in 2016, two major events happened. Brexit happened my dad died in the same week that Brexit was voted in. And Donald Trump later in that year came into power in the US. And I think that a kind of meeting of all of those forces had my anger had been growing for years, but at that point, the anger and the place where I fit had coalesced for me to be able to speak about things on two sides of the Atlantic, and to feel more centered about how I could speak about those things, that had to do with a social reaction for me.
When did, with the awareness of that, when did the anatomy of the memoir, anatomy feels like the right word to use here because of how it is in the body and of the body, when did the concept of the book as an anatomy framework that would then chapter focus on parts of the body, parts of your body and of Black and brown bodies, when do you think that began to affirm itself as the structure of the book? Because I'd love to hear what the process of writing that structure into being was like.
Yeah, I think that, again, it was something that was in my head for a long time, because I think what's interesting about being a person of such mixed heritage is that those racialized parts of the body don't necessarily conform to any of those ethnic racial identities. And so I wanted to dissect that. I wanted to dissect the biological background of race and to undermine it, really, and to look at it purely as a power construct. And so the fact of using the body, dissecting my body, which has got a particular genetic background, would allow me to talk about myself, which is, an important, I think the book is important to me, that I don't know that I can speak for it's not a book that tries to make pronouncements about things. It's really about my own way of dissecting race for myself, while obviously making an argument on some level. So the anatomy is very much also comes from the idea of that there's a hypothesis to this book. In other words, there are stories that I can't know. So I'm just, those 5 women at the beginning of the book are, one of them is my grandmother, and she's real, and I know her, but the others are people I had to assume might be like the people that were the women who were my ancestors. And so what it allowed me to do was set up an experiment that would say, this is my background, these are these people who might be mine, and let's look at their mine and their body parts too, and their racialized body parts. They're the body parts of the body that that people point out as being racially defining. And so I wanted to make this experiment, and then to somehow get to this point where DNA is not defining, so that the argument moves through a kind of experiment that comes to a findings section,
and which makes it feel, and again, I think this is extremely rare, it feels like a scientific inquiry almost. It's rooted in a heart investigation, and like nothing less than what animates the soul is at work here, and yet presented in a way that even a scientist or the most non-literary inclined of persons can intensely relate to. I see we have a comment here from Elizabeth McEwen, who is picking up on something that was said in your reading. And she quotes the line, "I am a song of sugar," and says, I feel like some of her students could relate to that. She's an educator from Florida. And I think it's a good point to focus on, because in a lot of ways, Shame on Me is asserting that the models of the plantation and the plantation society that Black bodies were forced into in Caribbean space remains in our modern society, a model that we are stuck with despite all of our attempts at liberation. So I wonder if we could speak to how the plantation society model continues to down people of color.
Yeah, I mean, well, the plantation is absolutely the kind of model, that the representation of the structural inequality that still exists, and I kind of go through that through the book, and it becomes a way of saying we absolutely need to get off this plantation. We need to undermine the structure, because we're stuck in this structure in which the most racialized people are in the field, so to speak, in the lowest rungs of of our society in terms of employment and socioeconomic worth, in a way, and then it goes in Guyana, the plantation. The white people in the Guyanese society made up about 3% of the entire population, and that colonial society ruled the plantation as the structure. And I think what reverberates for me is that small percentage of plantation owners currently in the world is still the same. There's a very, very small percentage of people who own how we function economically. The billionaires and the now trillionaire are safe, while we are endangered in various levels of the plantation society. And certainly, as we've seen through COVID and through the protests and the George Floyd protests, we've seen that those frontline people who are constantly in danger. And that's why I think we're still living in a plantation structure.
There's an incredible article that you've written recently that I feel it's important to speak about. And we'll share it with the audience in the comment box below and to the side. And it's written for Salvage, called "Stand Back: Reflections on a Memoir I Wrote Too Soon." And I'd like us to speak about that article, as it relates to both the timefulness of Shame on Me, and also the sense that, as you express in the piece, the publication of the book almost feels like it came too soon, given what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it's so clear to me that the way what we're seeing is a product of a colonialism and an empire thinking that hasn't gone away. And so, but when I say I wrote it's a memoir I wrote too soon, it's almost like the memoir, the book very much focuses on language and how we're made by language. I totally believe that I am a product of everything I've ever read, and that there's a lot of hope in the book that reading and imagining a new way of being in the world as people join together, as those people who have been oppressed or who want to get off the plantation, how together we can join up to invent language and therefore invent a world that is different. That's really the focus of the book. The book is very much about, we have imagination and we can use it to get off this structural inequality, or out of this, and that language is important. It's important to understand and to read and to be aware and to know what your place in the world. But I think one of the things that I've seen in the demonstrations in the US is that this idea of space isn't dealt with in the book as much as I would like to. In other words, when I say let's get off the plantation, where are we going? You know, where are we going to get off to? Because the world is obviously still functioning. There, as what I say in the piece, is that there are plantation overseers everywhere, you know, kind of asking for rent, demanding rent, kneeling on Black bodies, you know, calling the cops. You know, there are all kinds of things still in check about being a person of color, and particularly a Black person in this world right now. So I think the article is much more angry than imaginative. It's about needing the plantation to burn down right here, right now, so that we have this space, so that we have this planet, this earth, this concrete place of being together, rather than, and it's not that we don't need the imagination and that lyrical space to invent that place. I do think we need to still invent it with our language. But I just was so angry that I wrote that last weekend, and you know, in a flurry in a couple of hours. So that's what came out.
And I mean, what stays with me from the article is, in addition to everything you said, is the immense productivity of rage, and how rage and anger and every extreme emotion has been something that's been systematically stripped from Black bodies, from bodies of color, as if to say, these are the right ways you can protest and line up in an orderly queue and submit petitions to make your voice heard and your anger heard. And in a way, it feels like the article is also speaking to the book at the time of its publication, extending the voice of its rage and the arm of its rage. Because certainly, Shame on Me does express anger.
Yes, it does. And anger is something that, you know, in the article I say, you know, my friend who read the first draft, he said, you know, where's the hate and then the anger? And I ended up acknowledging it. But also it's something that I learned as a young person not to express. You know, I was a repressed, angry person, and that resulted in depression. So I spent quite a bit of my 20s in depression, and the book talks about how I went through psychoanalysis and learned how to understand and channel that anger to where it rightly belonged.
In the comments, Elizabeth, who we heard from first, follows up to say that yes, Belle Glade is literally 45-ish minutes west of Palm Beach, and it is a completely different world, which I think speaks to what we're saying about how we can function so differently in zones of anger, in zones of rage, and yet it feels to me, and I think it feels to you, it feels to the Black and brown people who are agitating for protests and change with all of themselves right now, that the world is changing. But what's been most frightening for me and sobering in the context of reading your book is that for many people who happen in a lot of cases to be white people, their worlds have not changed. Their worlds have absolutely not been impacted. Nothing is different for them.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that those are the kind of people who need to be reading books like yours? Or is that something that...
I think absolutely, but those are the kind of people who don't think that there's the people who don't think there's anything wrong, who think that they have made it on their own, and their accomplishments and their freedom, their so-called freedom to have things, is what they have a right to. And I think that is part of the problem. You know, that idea that freedom is, first of all, what you can buy, but also that freedom is something that we can have if on the backs of other people. And I think that's, for me, the biggest thing. You know, I was part of, as a young person, that liberal dream of, you know, moving up from, you know, the plantation field to work in the house, and to, you know, to have the things, to have a status that was that said that I'm free to do these things. And I just, that's what changed in the conceiving of the book, or the understanding through the research of the book, that I am not free. I am not free until we are all free. And so that freedom is a notion that is a 17th century notion from European philosophers who said liberalism is the way to free humanity, but only some humanity. You know, that it was the beginning of race science. And that's why the book is also related very much to science, because, you know, race science in the 17th century is the thing that began dehumanizing Black people, you know, and once you dehumanize anyone, then you can kill them, you know, then you can enslave them, and then you can ignore them and deny them their own freedom. And so, yeah.
Yeah, back to the comment section, Celia Sorando from Dominica is joining in, and she says, she's quoting you, "I am a product of everything that I've ever read." She says she loves that. I am alphabet soup. And, you know, so many things. And it also feels like a memoir that really articulates a love of reading, and not just a love of reading, but the ways in which reading has personally kept you alive. Yeah. I was very moved by that.
Yeah, it has, and I think also the reading and the books that I mentioned, they're the books that, you know, growing up in a white suburb in Toronto, going to a very, you know, mostly white high school, and you know, the things that you read are the things that you become. And so those books that I mentioned in the book are those books that helped me with my racial identity, you know, helped me with my understanding of myself as a woman of color, and all the different parts of myself, and to understand also that, you know, one of the books I mentioned early on is Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mass, and how important you know, those are the books that radicalized me, you know, that had me thinking about myself as a racialized being, that and how I functioned in the world.
And I think what's generous about the book as well is that it does that. It also makes space for, at every level, the lives of other people who have either overtly or violently or subversively challenged your right to exist, from that teacher in the classroom to the most well-meaning of people. And I'm thinking here of the early realization that your therapist's favorite book was Jane Eyre, and how the Bertha of White Sargasso Sea, who is Antoinette, comes to how she feels confronted by the reality of the world in Jane Eyre, which made me think of all the work that White Sargasso Sea has done as a text response to that. And so you're making room to tell a progressive and continuous story of your own life. But I feel like that on its own would be a remarkable thing. But what is, I think, singular about Shame on Me is how much space it makes at a table, even at a table that says we're not all equal, we can never all have the same experiences, but it's a book that to me feels deeply committed to listening at every level.
Yeah, thank you. One of the best comments I had from a reader was that she felt taken care of when she was reading the book, and I just felt that, you know, that was it. I could quit now. I'd be really happy, because that was special to hear.
And with a memoir like this, it occurs to me that, you know, you bring yourself in front of the lens, and unavoidably there is also a certain level of bringing the rest of your family to that portrait as well. And I'm deeply curious about how the differences and maybe difficulties of centering your family, where people see you, to a public kind of view is, because certainly for any writer, to put themselves in the spotlight is hard enough, but then you're also, the invitation becomes wider than that. It becomes familial almost. And at any point was that challenging? Did it feel heavy?
Yeah, it was challenging from the beginning, because I thought, you know, when I realized I was writing this book and that it was signed and that it was going to come out, I thought, oh my God, you know, what are the ethical things around this that I need to take into account? So I made sure that my whole family knew about it and read it before it went to not before it went to the publisher, but early enough that it was there was time to do things that, you know, take things out. But they bless them. I feel very, very grateful that they completely support it and were in encouraging and grateful themselves. My nieces and nephews that I mentioned in the book, they, I think, were the most affected by it. And I think it was very much for them. I wanted to leave something, in the article, I talk about having to have written it because having to be here now because of those ancestors, those patient women who were waiting for me to arrive. And I think the other reason that I needed to write it was for my young nieces and nephews who have not had difficult experiences as racialized people in Canada, but they didn't know that that's what their family went through. They're mixed in, and much more the lighter skin and pass in many ways, and so there's just a kind of curiosity when people look at them, but they were absolutely moved, and it was important for them to find out about their history. And I think it's also it's radicalized them in many ways to be able to speak up now. All of the young people have called me and said how difficult it is right now, and that they know that they can speak to me. So that's important.
I feel very much like, in as much as the book takes care of people, and I feel that that description is perfect for it, it also does so in a language that in no way underestimates the intelligence of the reader, but also feels deeply accessible. And to what extent do you think that framing the book in accessible language, in language that could meet people exactly where they were, particularly Black people of every age and brown people, was that something that was in your mind in the conceiving of the memoir?
In the conceiving of it, I was definitely, my readers were definitely my nieces and nephews. And so it was definitely something I wanted to have them understand. I didn't want to assume a huge amount of knowledge on the part of kind of the discourse of race. So I wanted to make it understandable and to hold them in it. But I must say that in the first draft, or the first couple of drafts, the language itself was much more distant, and my publisher, Anne Collins at Random House, was very much on my case. She really was very tough on me to say, be there, be you, don't hide behind a kind of a thought, don't hide behind the thoughts and the academic deconstruction of that thought, be there with you. And so that took a couple of drafts so that's really an important part of it too, in terms of the work you do with an editor, and how she was able to say that's what it needs that voice.
So for anyone who is just at this point joining us, welcome again to Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan in conversation with this year's nonfiction winner of the 2020 OCM Bocas Prize, Tessa McWatt. She has been reading from, and we've been discussing her remarkable memoir, Shame on Me. And just before I invite Tessa to read again, I want to encourage you to leave and you've been doing this, leaving your thoughts, your comments and questions in the comment box below or at the side of your screen. It's been really delightful to see so many of you tuning into the conversation. So Tessa, I also have one more question before I ask you to read again, which is, yes. I was challenged in all the best ways possible and prompted to do further, even more reflection by the combination of imagery and text in the book. I would like us to speak a bit about that, because you're bringing in scientific imagery, images from family photo albums, and they all so richly impact on the reading of the text. So could we speak about the selection of those images?
Yeah. Actually, the very first draft was slightly different in it, and it was in that it was a bit more. It tried to illustrate a bit more, and I think as a result, and also I had a wonderful reader in Christina Sharp who you know, really taught me about the impact of certain images and why I would use someone else's family other than my own family. And I'm really grateful for her to have pointed that out. And so a lot of those came out because you see a lot of images on the internet that are illustrative of a certain kind of horror around Black bodies. And I, you know, that just perpetuates that horror, and so that's something I didn't want to do. But so things like the more scientific ones were important because they were illustrated, and they kept this sense that there are ways of looking at the body that are misconstrued, you know, and then there are some really interesting ones, that the anatomy ones, you know, where the skin is coming off. They're very symbolic of how we think about skin and how we think about the body. And the one of the most devastating ones for me is the bound feet, because those are some actual bound feet of a Chinese woman, and so it just the kind of visceral connection to those feet. And then the family ones, you know, are a lot of them are ones that came from my cousin, because he's a kind of repository of all those older ones, and I really wanted to show who I was, who my family was, through those, just to see the whole array of faces that I grew up with. And then there's the photo of me and my brother and sister in Calgary, or no, in Toronto, celebrating being pioneers. It was ironic.
So Tessa, I'd like to invite you to do your second reading now, and then after that, folks in the audience, don't worry, we will still have some time for your last questions and thoughts. So Tessa, over to you.
Yeah. I'm going to read from the last section, which is findings, and it's a section after I get my DNA results, because I didn't really want to do the DNA tests, but I ended up doing them, and because one of the things is about the stories versus the biology that the book focuses on. But I'm going to read from that last section. So I've just received the DNA tests, and I've gone through them. This information doesn't make me feel distinct in any way. It does the opposite of defining me. It only allows a closer picture of how much movement I'm made of. My eyes share the epicanthic folds of people from many parts of the world, a biologizing of my body to classify it among others. But biology is insufficient when it comes to belonging. The DNA that forms me, the east, west, north, and south of me, is no more meaningful to my sense of belonging than the stories my mother told me as a child, or the stories I told myself of coming from everywhere. I do come from everywhere, but the books that have fed and ignited my imagination are far more defining than my DNA. A test of this type can only tell us about how human beings adapt to their surroundings on the planet, how we change, how we are infected by one another, and how we evolve features to help us to survive. Whereas books, literature, art, these show us all the possibilities of living itself. Someone once said that race is like 6 o'clock. That specific hour doesn't actually exist, but we agree upon it as a fixed point in the day, a social idea, both real and a construction. To deal with the idea is easy. I can dismiss it, demonstrate its absurdity by invoking the speed of light and the deja vus and time warps of my own experience. Just like 6 o'clock, the biological makeup of a human being is not a prescription for how to perceive that being. Time is mysterious, and we've all experienced its tricks. We don't have to agree that a day is divided into hours, but most of us go along with it. To deal with the real aspect of 6 o'clock, to have to make appointments and not miss flights, and the real aspect of race, to ask myself who I am in the face of pointed, perpetual anti-Black violence and discrimination, is a different kind of a challenge altogether. I spent most of my early life feeling I didn't belong anywhere, which paralyzed me personally and politically. That feeling was a product of the plantation. It served to divide me from myself and from others with whom I belong in action, in resistance. The shame of living in the master's house is debilitating, but my lack of belonging has been a red herring. I don't want to belong anywhere on the plantation. I have lacked the revolutionary leadership to be Kwamina, the enslaved man leading a rebellion, and I have been the obedient other. But it's time for disobedience, for action. Oh, the world. In our dispossession and our rage, we need to ask different questions. The single most powerful tool we have is our language and its ability to reinvent realities. We can talk and listen, undergo a collective psychoanalysis that sees us uncovering all that is difficult to know, the sources of shame and how we might move on from them. I desire a new language of belonging, a who are you space to gather in with others rather than the biological what am I. This new language finds the political in the personal, and it requires me to ask who I am in the face of any new race making that might be taking place. Who in me is the slave? Who the plantation owner? Who the indentured laborer, the bounty keeper? Who the collaborator? Who the perpetrator? Who the victim? Who am I othering as I write, as I speak, as I travel, as I shop? What borders am I erecting? Who am I when I don't feel I have enough?
Thank you so much for that, Tessa. I think I will confess I was so transfixed. I didn't exactly realize when you stopped reading. I could have happily listened to you just read the entire book. Thank you for that. We have a couple really thoughtful comments. One is from Tessa McWatt, which thanks you for the book and says that it helped her to feel seen and understood, which I think is beautiful.
Yes, thank you.
And also a follow-up comment / question from Elizabeth, who's been very active in our comments the entire time, which we're grateful for, who asks a question that I think ties in with something I've been curious to contemplate, which is the reality of books like Shame on Me are so indispensable now. But what options do you feel there are for those without access to your book, to these books, to the articles and engagements of protest and resistance that we need? Like, how do we translate the work for people who don't have access to it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge issue, and thanks for that question. You know, it's about dialogue, it's about conversation, it's about passing along you know, there are language issues for sure, but there are also access issues to technology, and you know, it's about somehow ensuring that those people that we are trying to empower have access to the technology, and it's the issue of the book in a way. You know, we need to make the important things, the important belongings of those who are free, accessible to those who are not.
Absolutely. If you know, I think about the role and importance of public and state national libraries here.
Absolutely, yeah.
I feel that Shame on Me should be a book that's accessible in every public library in the UK, in the US, in the Caribbean, because there are, as you say, there are ways in which those without access to these materials can be, and we've seen over and over again, are the ones who need it the most and who suffer because of it. Yeah,
one of the issues I have with my own sort of belief in changing the world through words and through books is exactly that. How do, you know, it's a quite an elite way of thinking about where change comes, but I do think that education and teaching, you know, and the teaching that comes, those who teach and can pass these things down to classrooms, you know, like that classroom I was in at the beginning of the book, you know, if that had only been a much more aware, decolonized classroom, we might have been able to speak more and have a conversation about what that whole, what the whole word is and what it means and what it means to call out someone's physical, biological appearance. And we didn't have that.
I think so much of the way that one of the statements you make at the end of the article that we've been speaking about, which calls for a destructuring and an abolition of the police state, which to a lot of people, I think, who consider themselves reasonable, seems drastic and seems preposterous. And it's a place in which I remind myself that the abolition of slavery seemed just as drastic and preposterous, not so long ago.
Yeah.
And I think
exactly.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to me as well, maybe a couple of years ago, it would have seemed preposterous and impossible, but the conversations that are going on now, I find really, really inspiring because to defund, someone said, what's wrong with defunding the police? We've been defunding education for decades, and if the money were redirected from the funds that go into policing to other ways of supporting communities and other ways of supporting young people and to actually protect them rather than oppress them, then that would be a huge structural change. And that's why I think it starts with that whole idea that the police are there to maintain the power of the plantation house, to maintain the structure, and so that the structure doesn't crumble. And I think the end of that article is very much about wanting the structure to crumble.
It is. The memoir, as much as the article, in the same and in different ways, offers a lot of tangible advice, I think, for the question that a lot of people will raise is that if you eliminate these superstructures, what do we create in its place? And I think that for people who are obsessed with the answer to that, you need to read Tessa's book, because in Shame on Me, there is not just a speculation about what a better world could look like, but there are tools to help generate that, tools of empathy, of productivity, of enshrining a need to listen to Black voices and people of color. Because I think that your memoir is significant on so many levels, not just for what it's proposing that we absolutely tear down, but it's radical in its generative property. And then I guess what I would ask is, it probably sounds slightly absurd that I hope that the thing that you've created can also offer you hope, because it gives so much of that to so many of us.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I had more hope when I wrote it than I have currently, but even now, again, I have hope again, because I'm hearing alternatives, and I'm hearing people say this can't go on. And one of the things that I think, if one of the things in terms of police, if we didn't have a military organization caring for us and protecting us, we would have one of the lines in the book is that we need radical mutual care. We need to be looking after each other in our communities and also joining up that care with other communities. There are communities of color, there are communities of gender and class that have been struggling alone within this structure for a long time, and joining them up. And I think that's what's happening. I think that's what we're seeing during these recent protests, that there are people from all parts of those oppressed areas of our society that are joining together to say, no, we're not going to be in, this doesn't work. And and I think if we did break it down, it would be about together making something new, with the funding that's coming from the police. So
I think this is a great moment for us to delve into our 3 envelopes game, which is something we do to start bringing the sessions down to a close. Those of you who've been with us before know how it works. It's very simple. I hold up envelopes 1, 2, and 3. Tessa will choose one, and then we'll engage with the question inside. So Tessa, 1, 2, or 3?
I'm going to choose 3.
Wonderful. Let's see what's inside. Okay, so inside envelope number 3 is the question. Shame on Me, that is the book, is on a revolutionary march towards justice for Black Lives Matter. Which 2 books by other writers are flanking it on either side?
I think that I'm going to cheat a little bit to say to say not necessarily 2 books, but on definitely, you know, the authors that allowed me to write Shame on Me, you know, the authors. So it's not so much flanking as coming before me, but also feel like I'm being flanked now in this current struggle. But I think everything that Toni Morrison ever wrote, and on one side, so I know that's a cheat. But if I had to pick one, maybe I would pick Beloved. And on the other side, I would probably pick Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House.
Those are extremely powerful choices. Thank you. I mean, having just read Beloved for the first time this year, I feel like it is a book that will be a very, very dear friend to me for my life. And we have a lovely comment from Marta Fernandez Campa here, who says, Tessa, I love your memoir, the way it challenges us to think about history and the ways in which family photos and archive are interwoven in your narrative, and how they are in conversation and counter the violence of documents from colonial archives, from the Archivo de Indias and others. Another history and stories are at the center. And I think
Thanks.
Beautiful comment to close things with is from Lucian Long, who says, just based on the strength of this exchange alone, he has been inspired to get and read your book, which is exactly my hope, that more people will know about Shame on Me, know how indispensable it is to the world in which we live, and how very grateful I am to you for writing it and sharing it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really am honored by having this conversation with you, Shivani. It's been really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa, again. And thanks to everyone who has joined us for this, the 9th episode of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. Please keep going with us. We're going to be here every week for the foreseeable future, every Sunday. Next Sunday is our 10th episode, which we're very excited about. Until I see you next time, please, everyone, stay safe and take care of each other. Thank you. Goodbye.